tell me again, why is this part on tape and the other part's not?
To preserve you. Well, I could have done the whole thing on tape, but it seemed to me that we didn't really need everything on tape.
Okay, fine, that's all.
I couldn't decide at the beginning what to do.
All right, now, you're a big guy,
Yeah.
you better not be sitting in that chair, it might collapse.
I think.
That's a flimsy chair, Peg warned me on this.
Oh,
I
okay.
think maybe one of those chairs over there is more
Okay.
solid for you.
All right, we can do that. You're worried after I sat down in that chair last night too hard.
Yeah, right. Well, you're a heavy, how much do you weigh?
Oh, 2 something,
Yeah,
2:15, 2:10.
yeah.
I'm probably bigger after eating Peg's cookie. I'll probably be even heavier.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Don't rock on it.
Okay. You are worried.
Well,
All right. Okay, so now we're moving
we don't
into...
know how they, we don't have the glue in these chairs.
All right.
Sometimes they're old, you know. I believe that's somewhat of an antique, but, no, it's not, and not in value, but it's old.
Is this the one you want me sitting in?
Yeah, that's right. I don't think there's a better one. No, there's nothing stronger. Go ahead.
All right.
But just don't try to move too much.
All right.
Okay.
So we're going to start with ABC now.
All right.
And you're at NBC, and you're thinking you'd like to run your own place. And what happens? Ted Shaker comes along?
Well, I wasn't thinking anything. I was just thinking about doing my job at NBC. I wasn't unhappy with the job at all, and they'd done very well by me up to that point. So I had a call from a fellow named Ted Shaker, whom I had known at CBS. He was a salesman at that time, and I guess he'd moved to ABC as a salesman also. And he said, would I come over and talk to his boss? And I said, about what? And he said, well, about being the head of the news department at ABC. And I said, no, I don't think so. I say, I don't want to be seen in that building.
Why not?
Well, rumors would start circulating, and I didn't particularly want to answer them because I didn't particularly want to go to ABC.
Why not?
Well, it was a third place network, and I didn't think, I hadn't heard anything that would convince me that, up to that point, I hadn't heard anything that would convince me that they were going to do anything with their news department, as far as I knew.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly hadn't been in the trade press if there was. The fact that they were looking for a news head, I knew because Jim Haggerty, when he left the White House after working for Eisenhower for 8 years as press secretary, had been running the news department and hadn't done very well with it. So but he had stepped down, or they'd removed him, and temporarily, I guess a man named Steve Riddleberger was sort of holding the place together, but he was not a newsman, he was a businessman. He was sort of the general manager of the place. He'd been with ABC in a number of business jobs. At any rate, I told him no.
And when was that? What about was that when you told him no?
Might be around the 1st of August in 1963. And no, it was in the summer. So then he called back again. And I said, well, would I do him a favor and come over? Well, I really didn't owe him any favors, but I wasn't against him at all. I mean, I just... so finally I said, well, maybe at the end of the day, I don't want to absent myself from ABC. In the middle of the day, people ask questions where I was and so forth. And, you know, we were busy. I mean, anyway, I told him I'd come over at the end of the day. ABC was located at 7 West 66th Street at that time, in an old a building which had over the years been a riding stable. When ABC was a spin-off from NBC, going back to days when NBC had two radio networks, the Red and the Blue. And the Red network was the one that had all the money-making shows on it. This is in radio, and the Blue carried all what they call sustaining programs. Those were usually artistic or musical programs that didn't have any commercials in them. The Department of Justice had told NBC that it had to divest itself of one of those networks, that it was not a monopoly, but it was a duopoly. And so they had sold the Blue Network to a businessman named Edward J. Noble, N-O-B-L-E, of Squibbs Beech Nut.
Lifesavers.
Lifesavers. So they had Squibbs, Beech Nut, and Lifesavers. Those were three of the products that people would remember. And so Noble had it and was having a hard time getting started. I don't think he may have owned one TV station in New York, but and maybe one in Detroit. But the Blue didn't have a TV network at all. Even later, when Goldenson finally bought it, I think at first they had just 5 stations all over the United States, and whereas the others had probably at that time maybe 100 stations each network had. Today
So they owned 5 stations, or they had 5 affiliates?
Well, counting both, they may have had 5.
Altogether?
Altogether, 5. You could only own 5 VHF stations, and the rest had to be affiliates. At any rate, then Edward J. Noble had run it for a while, and without any great financial success. So Goldenson had wanted to get into the business. He was the president of United Paramount Theaters, which was at first it was about 2,000 motion picture theaters from coast to coast. And that too had been a spin-off from the large Paramount organization in Hollywood. The antitrust division of the United States government had told all of the movie studios that they had to divest themselves of 2 of their activities. The 3 activities were one, production of pictures, the other was distribution, and the third was operating screens or motion picture theaters. At any rate, United Paramount Theaters was the one that wound up with the motion picture theaters. But Goldenson, as television came on, saw that he was losing audience in the motion picture theaters and thought that would continue as television grew. So he wanted to get in the television business. He wasn't going to get rid of the theaters immediately, but he knew that eventually he wouldn't have many theaters left. So at any rate, he negotiated to acquire ABC from Edward J. Noble, and the asking price for it was $25 million. And many years later, he sold it for $3.5 billion, but which had become worth at that time. But at any rate, he bought it for $25 million. And
which was a lot then. It was more than
it was a lot, because it was certainly a lot for what ABC had. So he was really paying for the potential. And one of his advisors, who used to tell me the story almost every time I saw him, was a man named John Coleman, who was a Wall Streeter. He'd been the son of a poor Irish New York cop, but had risen to head the New York Stock Exchange, and at that time he was a partner in Adler, Coleman and Company, which is a Wall Street brokerage house. And John Coleman told him, well, Leonard, if you want to get in the business, that's the price of entering the game. And so Goldenson didn't think it was worth it, but they kept trying to negotiate down, and Noble wouldn't negotiate down. And so he finally went to his bankers, one of whom was Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and got enough loans, bank loans and insurance company loans, to finance the $25 million deal. And that's when he acquired ABC. So that's what ABC was at that time, and that time he was negotiating for it and acquired it was about 1953. So 10 years later, he still hadn't really done a lot with it. He hadn't acquired stations as fast as he thought, and the stations he could acquire or could affiliate with were not very good stations, because NBC and CBS had been first and second in the field, and they had the good stations in any given city.
So when you were at NBC, did you ever consider ABC as competition?
No, not real competition, but they were in all the pools and things like that. I mean, we had to deal with them, like when we draw for positions on camera stands at conventions and things like that. Why, they were involved in that, but that was about all. They didn't have very much at all. In some days, I've heard old ABC time employees say that some weeks they couldn't even meet their payroll. They were suffering from cash flow, and so on the cash flow, one time they said that get the Detroit station manager to send them some money out of the bank. Detroit was one of the, well, they owned the Detroit station. Apparently it was making money, and so they had to press him to send in some of his cash flow so they could meet their payroll. I didn't know all that at the time. I've learned that since then, but at any rate, that's, so I'm talking to him about the time I went in there to talk with him. It was 10 years after they had acquired it. I had met Goldenson very casually, probably at a White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington or something like that. At any rate, I didn't know him, and other than knowing John Daly, who was their anchor man and news vice president, I knew him.
Who was?
John Daly?
Oh, no, the vice president was Daley as well?
Yeah, John Daly.
He did both those jobs.
Did both jobs, yeah. Mm-hmm. And as I told you yesterday, earlier in this conversation, he was also the host of What's My Line on CBS, which was CBS's best Sunday night show. It's a quiz show, and Dorothy Kilgallen, Bennett Cerf, and John Kieran of the New York Times, and so he was very well known, and he was a little too precise to be a good anchor man in today's terms. He was an American. He'd been raised, I believe, in South Africa, where his father was in the mining business, and he had some Anglophile pronunciations in some of his language and accent. But he was very nice. He'd been to Europe during World War II, and so Daddy was pretty well known, but he still did not have the financing of the staff or the infrastructure or anything else. And even by that summer of 1963, they still hadn't organized their own film coverage around the world in news.
Which you had done 10 years earlier at CBS. Right?
Yes, 10 years earlier. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So what convinced you to go to ABC?
Well, okay, so I went over and talked to the executive vice president and treasurer, who was a man named Simon B. Siegel, Siegel, and we talked a long time, and I asked him, well, what makes you think that that I can succeed at this job when John Daly didn't and Jim Haggerty didn't. They'd been the only two heads of news at ABC thus far in its history. And he said, well, Leonard says that we can't succeed, we can't be a full network until we have a good news department, and we're willing to put the money into it. And I got down talking some statistics, and I said, well, I guess I better hear this from Goldenson himself. He said, well, are you interested? And I said, well, I'm not committing today, but I want to hear more about it. So they arranged for me to meet Goldenson and Siegel in Goldenson's house on the Parkway in Pelham, New York. That's where he lived. So I was living in Westchester County too at the time, but on the other side of the county. Anyway, I drove over there on a Saturday afternoon. He lived nicely, but not really ostentatiously. I think the maid or whoever, some servant, gave us some ice water and a couple of cookies, but he didn't offer me a drink of any kind. And we had a long talk, and I told him that he would have to put, to compete, he would have to match the other networks step by step, certainly in election and convention coverage. That had been my main interest, both at CBS and at NBC, and at that time, those two fields, plus the leading news program, the Dinner Hour news program, those were the ones that people really rated, critics particularly, rated networks on. And so we got down to some specifics, and I said, well, you'd have to do gavel-to-gavel coverage, and you'd have to match the others step by step on the continuous coverage on tabulation of elections, and you'd have to get involved in that, and you'd have to have your own tabulation organization. And I had some specific figures, which he said he thought he could handle. One thing that I told him also he'd have to do, that he'd have to do at least 10 freestanding documentaries a season. And he said he thought he could do that. And I said, Ryan, you have to do it whether they're sold or not, even if you have to carry them sustaining. So I thought I had the solid commitments. It turned out later that I didn't, but at any rate, those were the points that we talked about. The salary wasn't a problem. I was more interested in just the actual dollars and cents of the salary. I was more interested in the longevity of the job. And so I said I wouldn't consider anything less than a firm 5-year contract.
Why was the longevity suddenly an issue for you?
Because I had 2 children.
But you'd been moving back and forth between.
Well, but the other 2 networks were to me were a known quantity, and he was an unknown quantity.
So if you were going to take a gamble on him, you wanted to.
Yeah, well, I wanted, if I had to be fired or walk out, I wanted 5 years' pay. I was 50 years old at the time. Well, maybe 50 years old is not old today, but I thought that was pretty. I wasn't looking to change many more times during my career. As a matter of fact, 65 at that time, if you look back to 1963, 65 was the Social Security age for retirement, and in most companies it was the age. Well, of course, today it's not at all. You can stay as long as you want, I guess, in most companies, as long as you can come to work every day. At any rate, I thought, well, 5 years firm, and if I'm kicked out tomorrow, I'll have 5 years pay and certainly find another job in 5 years. Even then, I was interested in teaching, journalism someplace, and while I hadn't really started doing many lectures at that time, even when I went back to school at Northwestern in 1940 and took 2 courses at Northwestern University, I was thinking of going on and getting an MA at any rate. So if I wanted to teach someday, I could. So I figured, well, 50 years old, and I've worked here 5 years. I mean, I can probably get a teaching job somewhere, and 55 wouldn't be too old a job, and I'd still have, say, 10 years to give to some college as a teacher. And that was really what I had that in mind as a fallback position. I wasn't ready to really make any long-term commitments, but that's how I thought my career might unfold for the next 15 years. He gave me enough reassurances that I said, well, I'd like to think it over and talk to my wife over the weekend, and I said, did he have the power to make the full commitment? I wanted a contract, and I wanted it approved by his board of directors. I think 5-year contracts in ABC at that time had to be approved by the board of directors. And the board of directors, this was over, the last conversation I had with him was over a weekend. It was on a Friday or Saturday, but at any rate, he said, well, he was sure the board would approve it, but on a certain Monday, that was when they'd meet, and that's the first time they could consider it. First time, and just normally be on their agenda. So, as usual, my word started to leak.
How did you know that?
Well, earlier, even before Ted Shaker called me to ask me to come over, it was generally known that ABC was looking for a news director. And Bill McAndrew, my boss at NBC, had asked me if they had approached me. And I said, no, they hadn't, which was true at that time. And the reason he asked me that was that about a year before that, before I'd been made a vice president at NBC, CBS had made a run at me. And I'd briefly considered returning to CBS, but they didn't want to give me the money I thought I should have, or the power that I thought I should have, because we'd beat NBC under my direction and beaten them very badly in an election, in tabulating an election.
56? No.
Well, it was
no,
it was probably one of we used to tabulate even local elections at that time.
Yeah.
And one of them we beat them badly on, which they got blamed for, was
62 maybe.
was 61 mayoral,
Okay.
which I believe was a Jersey governorship at the same time. And by that, but by 63, Sig Mickelson was out. He was kicked out of CBS.
Friendly then.
Huh?
Was it
No,
Fred Friendly then?
no, Richard Slant.
Oh, okay.
Richard Slant. Well,
Briefly, that's right.
well, Slant was in a holding operation, and then Friendly, and then
That's
Slant again. Slant was a lawyer, and he was on the corporate staff. At any rate, McAndrews asked me, he said, well, if anybody makes an approach to you, will you let me know? And I said, yes, I would. And so after I had that meeting with Goldenson, I told him, I said, well, a week ago you asked me about this, and I told you nobody made a run at me, and now they have. And he said, well, have you made up your mind? I said no, which I hadn't given them my final answer yet. My final answer. Is that the final answer? So it simmered like that for a day or two. And I guess Bob Kintner was in Europe on vacation at the time. He was in France. And so Bobby Sarnoff was really running the asylum. And so I guess McAndrew must have told Bobby Sarnoff, and or they may have been in touch with Kintner in Europe. I don't know. But at any rate, they said, well, we want to propose a new contract. And I said, well, all right, I'll listen. I haven't given the final answer yet, but I'll listen. And they turned it over to a businessman who was, I believe he was the head of the personnel department at the time, a man named George Fuchs, Fuchs. And George Fuchs, he was a nice fellow, and I knew him, and I had some dealings with him over the years, and so we got along all right, but he had been given his parameters, I could see, by presumably Bobby Sarnoff. And the most he wanted to do was, I think, about $30,000 a year on a 3-year contract, which I didn't think was very much. I certainly didn't think the longevity was much, and I told him that the 3 years was unacceptable. So they let it set like that for a while, day maybe. Then the ABC board hadn't met, so I didn't feel I was committed until their board did meet and offer me something actual, piece of paper, the contract. And so before that happened, they said, well, Bob Sarnoff would like to talk to you. And Bob Sarnoff I didn't find very persuasive. And he wasn't upping the ante at all. But I remember one thing he said to me which rubbed me the wrong way. He said, well, what do you owe ABC? What do you owe Cy Siegel? I said, well, I don't owe him anything. No, I owe myself and my wife and my children something. I didn't insult him by saying, I don't owe you anything either. I've given you more than I've been paid for. But that's the way I felt. And as he wasn't offering really any more, as much, the ABC, I think, was starting salary of $43,000 on 5 years firm, which at that time, I suppose, was maybe the going rate. Oh well, if you were connected with a program that's a money-making program, I think the salary was more than that. But well, one time at CBS, I had in the mail, salary check mails they used to put in your mailbox in an envelope. And somebody put Fred Friendly's in my envelope one time, and I saw that he was making $1,000 a week, $52,000 a year.
What year was that?
Well, that would have been that would have been before 1958, because I wasn't there after that.
Good money.
Yeah. And so I thought, well, what the hell? I mean, I'm going to work my ass off with elections and conventions and everything. I got to get 52,000, and that's why I had not succeeded when CBS had approached me to come back. I said my asking price, my bottom line is $52,000. Fred Friendly's making it, I'll make it too. Which I didn't make, but there. So, at any rate, the NBC just didn't up the price. And so the ABC on, must have been about the 14th of August, the ABC board met, approved the contract. And I went over and told McAndrew that I was going to accept. And a week later, I went to work for ABC.
What was the reaction at NBC when you left?
Yeah, they were upset. These people think, as I told you earlier, these guys, both CBS and NBC, thought one man was that important. And I knew what the organization was. I knew what my contribution was. My contribution wasn't the key in the thing. I mean, yes, hard work and so forth, and coming up with new ideas from time to time. But they had so many people, they had so much talent, and I knew what the talent was. I don't think they knew what talent they had at either place.
Well, Kintner had no loss of love for Goldson.
No, he didn't. And I always thought that later that if I had delayed, which I had delayed accepting ABC's offer, or if Kintner had not been in France at the time, I had thought that he would have done better for me. And why they were so picky about the 3 years without adding any money, they didn't even make a commitment of, well, we can only do 3 years because that's our policy, but because of that we'll give you $40,000 or $35,000 or whatever. They didn't make a counteroffer like that. I thought their counteroffer was just no counteroffer at all. I would have been getting a raise of, well, for the first year, maybe $5,000. You did get some bonuses at NBC in stock and half in stock and half in cash, I believe. But there weren't any other great fringe benefits at the time.
Well, other than what you told Goldenson
Yeah.
in terms of what needed to be done, were there other things that what did you think needed to be done in order to succeed at ABC?
Well, we just needed more money. Well, for one thing, thing I left out is during this period in which I was considering the ABC offer, I called a friend of mine who had been at ABC, been at CBS, and actually he was my next door neighbor by that time in Hastings-on-the-Hudson. A man named Jack Bush, who I mentioned earlier, had started out with the March of Time. And Jack Bush and his wife had moved to Hastings-on-the-Hudson from Brooklyn. They had a couple of children, and just by chance, they had bought a house that was right next door to our house in Hastings on Terrace Drive. So I didn't go talk to Jack at his home, but I invited him to lunch at the New York Athletic Club, and I asked him who was going to be head of ABC News. He had gone from CBS to ABC. He had moved, and he was head of all the cameramen and soundmen and the laboratories and the library. He had the factory. Nothing to do with the reporters, but with the union people and the technicians. And he was a pretty tough guy, and yeah, it was a good sense of humor. And I knew 53 when we were all young and when CBS News was just starting. And I said, "Who's going to be your new head?" And he said, "Well, I hope I'm looking at him." I said, "Well, you may or not, you may be, and you may not be." But what I wanted to know was, I said, "Is this organization for real?" And he said, "Well, I think so." And he told me about what he was about to engage in, which was hiring crews and setting up their own coverage around the world, in the United States and around the world. And they had approved that before I went there. If they hadn't approved that, I wouldn't have talked to them any further.
So they were using Fox Movie Tone?
Yeah, Fox Movie Tone and maybe Telenews at different times. One time they'd had Telenews, one time they'd had Fox, but one or the other. And with those two organizations, one, they weren't too well placed anyway, but you didn't really control them, and you couldn't always get them to have the finished film coverage, or you needed it, and when you needed it, in time. So it was not a satisfactory way, but that's all they could afford up to that summer of 1963. So Jack told me what he was doing, and even before I accepted the job, he and his wife took off on a trip to London, where he started hiring the crews and setting up their own film coverage in London, and then he went on to Paris and Rome and setting this thing up, and later in Tokyo and Moscow, the Middle East, probably Bangkok. So anyway, that was an important factor of them having their own coverage. But they thought that I knew what the budget was at NBC for the election coverage at the time, and I thought the Goldens wouldn't be able to afford it. My recollection is that I needed to cover the election that year $800,000 just for tabulation of results, gathering and tabulation of results, and he said he could afford that. As it turned out, we did afford it. We did organize it. There was one thing where he let me down on, and that was on the documentaries. Well, I'm getting ahead of the story, but at any rate, well, what did NBC think? Well, they couldn't get me out of there fast enough, really. And again, they thought I'd take all the proprietary information with them, as Mickelson had written. You tell me he's written in his book. And again, Marilyn Glass, my secretary, who had been with me at CBS and NBC, went along with me, but we didn't rifle any files or anything. We didn't take a thing. We took our pens and pencils, and by the end of the week, that was on a Monday, and I was going to go to work at ABC on Monday the 24th of August, and by the end of the week they were a little tired of seeing me around there, because there was a constant string of people at my office wanting to know what I was going to do and wanting to discuss it with me and so forth. And some asking for jobs. Not everybody. I mean, not everybody wanted to move, but there were a few people who were willing to take a chance, or perhaps had been passed over for something at NBC and thought they'd like to go somewhere else.
Did you end up hiring any of them?
Well, later we wound up hiring a few, but it was pretty hard to get the good ones to come, because they didn't feel there was enough solidity to the company. But we hired a few. I got one good guy from CBS, Bob Salmon, and he was a very good man, and he took the chance because he had sort of been in a rut at CBS, and he took the chance, and it turned out pretty well for me. He worked there until he retired, which was about 25 years. So that NBC, when Kintner returned, he never did call me or comment on it, and I didn't expect him to, but he appointed Julian Goodman to be the counter move to Elmer Lauer, and to do everything he could to keep Lauer from succeeding in anything at ABC.
How'd you find that out?
Goodman told me later. Well, after Kintner's death, I think he told me that. But we were friends, we still are. He lives down here, not far away, 25 miles away from here now. And summertime, I guess he's here. I've seen him occasionally. Life was not all a bed of roses at ABC, even from day one, because you had to get a news department doesn't exist in a vacuum, and you have to have help and support from almost everybody in the organization. And so I had to work on that support, and all of those department heads, all of them didn't have money, or have the budgets, in their annual budgets to give the news department the support they did. The engineering department was very poor. It was more inept than I had been led to believe. I didn't think it would be great, but I thought at least it would be efficient, which it wasn't. Some nights it was a sort of amateur television night. They'd make so many technical errors. You call for a role, and these were before videotape, and we did a lot of double chain stuff after we taught our cameramen how to do that and the editors how to do it, and rolling the A roll and the B roll, and sometimes you have the A roll and the B roll wouldn't run or something. So there were a lot of technical errors, and ABC had really not done a full election coverage before, and that was facing us. See, this is August of 1963, and 1964 is the first primary was going to be in New Hampshire in February. I don't think there was an Iowa caucus in those years. So New Hampshire was the first test that the election machinery had. So I had to put in place an election machinery by February. So I had 5 months. August, well, maybe just September, October, November, December, and January. So let's pause there while I go to the pit, and we'll resume at that point.
So you've barely gotten it settled into the job.
Yes, so I
by
went
November.
So I went to work there on August the 21st, and my good secretary, Marilyn Glass, came along with me about a week later, and there we were, up on the 7th floor of 7 West 66th Street. The whole company was, well, there were buildings scattered up and down the street, but the main executives were all in there, and the newsroom was in that building also. The news was, the anchor man was Ron Cochran. He was a man from Iowa who had been in the FBI for a while. I don't know where he got his news experience, but he had been a local anchor man for WCBS TV, Channel 2 in New York. Well, when I worked there, actually he was in Washington when I was in Washington for CBS, so I knew him from there. And he was a very decent guy. He wasn't somebody I thought was going to lead us out of the wilderness as an anchorman, but that's what it was in 15 minutes. So that meant 11 and a half minutes of news. Now, before I left NBC, both CBS and NBC had been planning on going to a half hour after Labor Day. And CBS made the first announcement of it. I think they had made that announcement before I left NBC. And NBC countered the announcement the next day. So Walter Cronkite, by that time Walter Cronkite had succeeded Douglas Edwards as the anchor at CBS. And he had, on Labor Day of 1964, '63, September, he had Jack Kennedy on with him, who was, for the Labor Day weekend, was in Hyannisport. So that was a big coup, and NBC, I believe, started its the next day. So that was a really tough competition, because whoever we had as anchor at ABC, whether it was Cochran or somebody else later, was up against Huntley and Brinkley, who had come out of the 1960 election with flying colors, and Uncle Walter, who still wasn't known as the most trusted American, but he was very popular. He'd been on the news about a year at that time, on the network evening news. Yeah, something over here, maybe with my nostrils. Probably allergic to it. And so he was doing very well. And of course they had pretty good lineups of stations. So they went to a half hour, but you know, we were nowhere near going to a half hour. I knew what kind of a staff we had at both places, both NBC and CBS, to do a half hour news. I'd done the budget with the NBC half hour news, and I knew exactly what they were planning to spend. And I knew what ABC had, and the ABC affiliates didn't want to do it, but anyway, they had such a weak lineup of stations. We didn't have a single station in the whole state of Ohio that carried Ron Cochran in the news. You know, a big population and a big industrial state, you haven't got an outlet.
Went on for some time too, didn't it?
Oh yeah, it was quite some time. Several years later, I don't think we got a full lineup in Ohio until we finally went to a half hour.
67.
Well, when?
67?
67 probably, yeah. I think, yeah, it was, 66 or 67. Probably 67. It was, well, wait a minute, it was 2.5 years after they did. So they did it 63, 64, 65, probably 66. Probably sometime in 66. What could we do? Well, we just did the best we could in covering in 15 minutes, and started preparing for the election to at least compete on election night, the primaries, and the two conventions. There weren't as many primaries then. There were some, and they were becoming important, but still.
Convention was still more important.
Conventions. You still had to win it at the conventions, and so. So we were doing that, and I was traveling a bit because we had the two conventions were going to be one in San Francisco and one in Atlantic City. No, Atlantic City hadn't been chosen. That wasn't until after Kennedy was assassinated. At any rate, the Republican was in San Francisco, and I think that had been set. And then as the new affiliate meetings all around, and my job was really not one of, say, sitting at a desk and operating the news or making the assignments. It was trying to sell affiliates on the idea of we're going to have a good news organization, and they should support us.
What was their reaction initially?
Well, to me personally, because I had a good reputation at CBS and NBC, I'd had some publicity, not a lot, but it was fairly well known in the trade that the contribution I'd made at those two places. So they believed in me, but as one fellow said later, well, Elmer was either the bravest guy in the world or he was nuts. He said, I don't think he's nuts, but anyway.
You don't think Goldenson was sending a signal that he was serious by hiring you? Or at least it was...
Well, they were impressed by that, but realists know that it takes more than one man to do that. I mean, yes, it's good to have a leader who, one, is respected in the business, and two, knows what he's doing in covering the news and knows what it takes, and can make sound business decisions. I had to start from scratch in getting up a budget for the election year. And there wasn't any budget for that. I mean, there wasn't one on paper. And they hadn't started it by the time I arrived there, so I was really starting from scratch there. They had a budget for the day-to-day operations. The budget, I later figured out, for the year, it was either the year I arrived or the upcoming year, which would either be 63 or 64, was about $3.5 million a year. And later on, I got it up as high as, I believe, 65 million before I turned the thing over to Sheehan, which would be 11 years later.
How do you go about getting your budget to be bigger?
Convinced Leonard Goldenson. Some things, like capital expenditures, had to go to the board. If it's a big capital expenditure, you have to get it approved to the board, and there the news president would go and make a presentation.
Like building a model for space coverage or a set for election?
Nothing that detailed, an overall figure. Well, we had to get, to post election results on the board. You've seen some of the pictures upstairs. We had to buy those in Italy. The company that made them at that time, the best figures, the clearest figures, were from a company, Ben Blank will tell you this later, but because he was one of those guys he went over. Ben Blank is the graphics presentation in charge of that. He had to have figures that were clear, because many of these things, like the clock, the digital clock in my bedroom, wouldn't be any good at all on an election night, even if you made it 10 times as large, because the figures are off center on a lot of digital clocks. So this company in Italy, for some reason, they were the leader in that field, and so anyway, he and the engineering department had to take a trip to Italy, and had to find out what the whole cost was going to be. This is to do, 50 states on election night for a presidential year. So we.
The board would have to approve your election.
Well, the overall, yeah, well, the capital expenditure part of it at least, and but they weren't too picky about that. The board received me pretty well there. Goldenson, let's say I went to work there on August 21st. Probably in September there was a board meeting, and I thought I had a very good reception from the.
You had your first board meeting.
It was probably in the first part of September. They usually, I think, met on a Monday, so I suspect it was shortly after Labor Day. I don't think I knew anybody on the board, except I might have met Robert Hinckley, who was in Salt Lake City and had been in the government, and he'd been with Edward J. Noble in the old Blue Network. And Noble still had stock in ABC, and the purchase price, I guess he kept some of his interest, and so Hinckley was his representative on the board to protect his interests in ABC. Who could lead? They were doing something that Noble thought was wild and not in his best financial interests. Hinckley could raise a fuss about it. So he was on the board, and there was a theater man from Iowa who was on the board. He was a holdover from the old Paramount Theater circuit, I think. And John Coleman, this Wall Streeter that I mentioned before, was on the board. And as Metropolitan Life had supplied the financing for Goldenson to support ABC, to buy ABC, Metropolitan Life